Katie. Welcome back to Making Waves. Well, a couple of weeks ago, I made a video about crime statistics on cruise ships. So there was a law that was enacted back in 2010 that required certain types of crimes to be reported. I'll link that video up here. But it piqued my interest into what types of true crime stories I could find that occurred on cruise ships. And I have a pretty terrible one for you today, so stay tuned. Let's talk about it. So in that video I mentioned, I said that I'm a little bit of a true crime aficionado. Now, I hate the crime, of course, but I do find kind of the psychology behind why criminals do what they do somewhat fascinating. My husband Will does not enjoy seeing true crime dramas or true crime documentaries. It keeps him awake at night. I think that maybe means he's a better person than I am. But it is interesting to me. So I started doing some research and I came across the story of Karen Waltz Roston. Now, this took place back in the 80s, and I'll start off by telling you a little bit about Karen, and then we'll move into the story. So Karen and her sister grew up in Florida. They were raised by their single mother, and they didn't have a lot of money growing up. The family operated on really kind of a shoestring budget, again, due to it being a single parent household, but they spent a lot of time at the beach. And Karen herself was quite interested in dance and went on to become quite an accomplished dancer, including in ballet. Now, as an adult, she was a massage therapist. And one day she met Scott Roston. Scott Roston was a chiropractor in Florida, and he had fallen down some stairs and sustained a back injury. As part of his treatment, he went to see Karen for massages. Now, they were both very into physical fitness. Karen was actually known to walk 10 miles a day, sometimes multiple times a week, and just very focused on being fit. Scott Roston also shared this interest, and so they struck up a friendship and then began dating. At some point, Scott moved to California. I think he may have been from there originally. And Karen would fly out and see him. And after only a few months of dating, they became engaged. Now, it's been reported that Karen's mother felt some kind of way about Scott. She felt he was a little too perfect, or tried to put out this perfect image. Not a hair out of place. There was just, her spidey senses were tingled. Let's just say that. She even went so far, it's reported, as to having Karen's pear-shaped engagement ring appraised to see if it was actually cubic zirconia. I couldn't find anywhere the results of that, but suffice it to say, Karen felt some kind of way about Scott. So after just a few months of dating, 26-year-old Karen and 36-year-old Scott went to Las Vegas and got married in February of 1988. 2 days later, they left for their honeymoon, which was a 7-day cruise from California to Mexico on board the Star Dancer cruise ship, and I'll throw a picture of it up here. The Star Dancer at that time was operated by Sundance Cruises. On the last night of their cruise, in the early morning hours, Scott reported to cruise personnel that Karen had gone overboard. So an immediate search ensued. Meanwhile, Scott is being questioned by both the Coast Guard as well as the cruise ship personnel. He said that they had been on the upper deck of the ship on the jogging track. Seems like an odd time to be on the jogging track, but that's what he said. And he said a huge gust of wind came and it blew Karen overboard. I know what you're thinking, because I'm thinking it too. So as you may know, cruise ships and cruise lines keep very good track of the weather and they keep good records of the weather. And so they had consulted their records and found that the top wind speed that evening was 5 miles an hour. So it seemed pretty unlikely. So when they mentioned this to Scott, he's like, "Oh, I'm just, I'm in shock. I don't think I recounted that story correctly. She actually fell overboard. I did my best to save her before she went all the way over, and I just couldn't save her." Now, add to this the fact that Scott had some wounds on his face, some pear shaped wounds.
That's suspicious.
Added to the somewhat sketchy accounts by Scott Roston, fellow passengers reported that they had witnessed Scott and Karen arguing. One of these included some fellow dining passengers who said that Scott was very upset with Karen that she didn't know which silverware to use for which course. Now, if you'll recall, Karen came from very humble beginnings, so it's unlikely that she had very many fine dining experiences. It also just seems like such a weird thing to be terribly upset about. It was also reported on another occasion that Scott was quite upset with Karen because she had eaten or indulged in some sweets. So Scott sounds just like a peach of a guy, doesn't he? If you know what I mean. I mean, they're on their honeymoon. I'm indulging in sweets if I'm on my honeymoon, or let's face it, any cruise vacation. Um, there's time to diet, but vacation isn't one of them, at least as far as I'm concerned. So there were some reports of these squabbles and arguments by multiple passengers. So the search for Karen's body ensued. Her body was located. It was roughly, I think, 25 or so miles off the coast of San Diego. Interestingly enough, the coroner's report said that her body was found floating, which indicated that she was likely alive when she entered the water, but that she had made no attempt to swim. If a body goes in the water, the person's alive, and they attempt to swim, it causes those air bubbles in the clothing to dissipate. But it appeared she had made no attempt to swim, but that she was alive when she entered the water. She did ultimately die of drowning. However, there were very obvious signs of manual strangulation. Meanwhile, of course, there's an investigation going on the ship, and embedded in the kind of rubberized jogging track were parts of an earring that Karen had been wearing, along with several strands of her hair. So, needless to say, it's not looking good for our friend Scott Roston. So, as you might imagine, when the ship arrived back in the port of Long Beach, California later that morning, Scott Roston was arrested for the suspicion of the murder of his wife of 9 days. Now, while in custody, Scott offered up yet another explanation for Karen's death. And hold on to your seats on this one. He claimed that Israeli agents had killed Karen as retaliation for an anti-Israeli government book that Scott had written several years prior. So apparently Scott and his parents had emigrated to Israel several years before. In Israel, Scott operated a non-licensed chiropractic care center and got into some sort of legal trouble. His account is that he refused to marry the daughter of a neighbor that they were somehow beholden to. I'm not sure the exact scenario. But after they came back to the United States, Scott wrote this book and paid to publish 1,000 copies of it. Only one copy was sold. So this book wasn't widely read. This seems like kind of a grasping for straws. So Scott was ultimately charged with second-degree murder. The jury kind of saw right through his excuses, did not believe there was any sort of, Israeli espionage against him. and they found him guilty. He was then sentenced to life in prison. Now, Scott Roston appealed this, claiming that the jury didn't have the option to consider a lesser sentence. Apparently, some sentencing laws had changed, and the jury, according to Scott and his lawyer, should have been advised that they could consider a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, as well as a somewhat lighter sentence. The appeals court upheld his verdict, but they did lower his sentence from life to 33 years and 9 months. Now, I found a report somewhere that said that Scott Roston was released from prison in 2017, but I couldn't substantiate that anywhere else, and the math doesn't quite add up to me. So Scott Roston today would be 71 years old. Based on the term that he was given, he would be eligible for parole likely here in the next year or so. And so that is the story of the tragic death of Karen Waltz Roston. If you enjoy true crime and you enjoy cruising, I hope you'll give this video a like. It helps our channel out a lot. And I would love it if you would consider subscribing to the channel. We post lots of videos about cruise tips, cruise packing, cruise reviews, and possibly even some more true crime on the high seas. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy cruising.